Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, MEI's managing editor.
Today's episode marks the launch of a revamped Middle East Focus, the Institute's flagship podcast. Matt and I will be your hosts going forward, and every week, we'll be talking to scholars, analysts, experts, and practitioners about the key issues and trends shaping the region. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy with Gunul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
We're delighted to welcome MEI's new president and CEO, Ambassador Stuart Jones. We'll be speaking about the big picture trends shaping the Middle East, U.S. policy toward the region under the new administration, takeaways from his experience in Iraq as ambassador and his time in the private sector, and how he sees Iraq's strategic role in the region at a time of change. Ambassador Jones joins the Institute after a 3-decade-long career with the U.S. Foreign Service, during which he served as the U.S. ambassador to Jordan and Iraq, among other roles. After his government service, he transitioned into the private sector, serving as Senior Vice President and President for Regions and Corporate Affairs at Bechtel Corporation, a global engineering, construction, and project management firm. Stu, welcome to the podcast, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be here. Appreciate it.
So I want to begin with your thoughts on the broader regional landscape. The Middle East has gone through a period of tremendous change over the past year and a half since Hamas's deadly attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, and everything that followed in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, and Syria. So what have been the most transformative or paradigm-shattering regional shifts of the past 18 months?
Well, as you said, obviously the events on October 7th, 2023 were very impactful for the region. They were, as you said, deadly and awful. But that also unleashed then a series of events that have been very impactful for the region, the strikes in Gaza and also in the West Bank, and also the conflict in southern Lebanon. At this point, we're back to not having a ceasefire in Gaza, and those of us who want to look forward we need to think about ceasefire in Gaza. We need to think about reconstruction in Gaza. We need to think about regional cooperation and integration that makes that possible. Clearly, that involves the defeat of Hamas and cooperation by the states in the region to enable the people who do no longer want to live under Hamas to reclaim their lives. But the other really exciting thing is Tehran and its proxies have clearly been set back in their efforts to interfere in the region and to make progress difficult. So what we're seeing now is a new government in Lebanon, which shows promise. The collapse of the Assad regime has deprived the Iranians of a channel for supplying rockets and missiles that threaten Israel and other countries in the region. And Iran itself seems to be on its back foot strategically in the region and taking a quieter tone. Right now, so many opportunities for change and advancement in the region, but, real risks. The new regime in Syria, still an unknown. The new government in Lebanon, still an unknown. And again, what comes out of the situation in Gaza, that needs clarity.
Yeah, you're certainly describing a region very much in flux, but of the changes that we have been seeing, how durable do you think they will be? And what will policymakers and diplomats be wrestling with and trying to disentangle for years or maybe even decades to come?
The Trump administration is an administration that prides itself on making deals. When this president was elected, in talking to our friends in the region, they acknowledged that he will bring a transactional approach to the region. And many find this refreshing and welcome because it puts the terms of the deal on the table. So what we're seeing right now is the administration is going to prioritize the Russia-Ukraine issue, but obviously also very active on finding solutions on Gaza. So you're going to see, I think, a focus on finding peace between Israel and Palestine. That's one deal. I think then there's another deal to be had, which is normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So that's another deal to be had. And then, of course, the big master deal is finding some sort of a modus vivendi, a new deal to ensure that Iran does not proceed with its nuclear weapons programs and also stops supporting miscreant organizations in the region that are blocking progress.
Here in Washington, we're about 2 months into the Trump administration's time in office, and I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot to take in on a wide variety of fronts. What have been your initial takeaways from the administration's early moves on the Middle East?
Well, I think we have to put things in context. So I remember at the beginning of the first Trump administration, then Deputy National Security Advisor KT McFarland gave an address to the diplomatic corps, and I was able to sit in, but she was really speaking to foreign diplomats here in Washington. And she said that the new Trump administration, 2016, is going to bring a new way of communication in terms of diplomatic intercourse. She highlighted, FDR's fireside chats on the radio. She highlighted JFK's early press conferences, and she said that President Trump would bring also a very new and fresh communications approach, utilizing all the new social media technologies and capabilities. And of course, we've seen that. And we've also seen that sort of a rejection of traditional diplomatic vernacular, if you will. For diplomats, I mean, we spend a lot of time looking at public remarks by foreign leaders and trying to interpret exactly what they mean. What are the hidden meanings? What are the signals? What are the hidden nuggets? And the Trump administration sort of rejects a lot of that and throws out messages that are very strong and in some cases passionate and tell you where they're going. And sometimes it's not always clear what they really mean. The example is when the president talks about creating the Riviera in the Middle East for Gaza, what's he really getting at there? It's not clear to me that even he believes that that's possible. It certainly sends a signal to the region that they have a higher level of responsibility and accountability to come up with a solution. And that did lead to the Arab proposal for Gaza. So if that's what he was looking for, that was successful. But I think the way he communicates is different than all of his predecessors and also other leaders around the world. I just come back to the transactional piece. I mean, this administration is going to bring deals, and I think they're interested less in sort of government to government and country to country relationships. Maybe they really don't think that those relationships are important or vital or meaningful. Of course, they're entitled to their view. As a diplomat, I find that troubling because, yes, it's true that when you're negotiating a deal, there's a transactional element. But sometimes in foreign relations, you don't have the luxury of a transaction. Sometimes in foreign relations, you're in a situation where you have to go to your partner and say, hey, this is what we need right now. Hey, we've captured this terrorist and we need him or her secured or deported to the United States. And there's a political risk here for you, but we're counting on you to do it. And your partner does it because of the relationship. And so that's an area of concern for me and something that I hope that the Trump administration will examine.
Looking at the administration's policies, I think you did a really great job in highlighting some of the through lines between what we saw in the first term and what we're seeing now. What do you see as kind of new areas or new developments this time around?
In the first Trump administration, the signal achievement in foreign policy, I think, was the Ibrahim Accords. And that had tremendous benefits for Israel and it had tremendous benefits for the Arab states that subscribed. Probably the reason that Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th was to set back the possibility of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But that opportunity still remains. And of course, that's an opportunity that goes even beyond Saudi-Israeli relationship because there's a U.S.-Saudi component to this too. There's an opportunity here for civil nuclear cooperation, which doesn't exist in the absence of Saudi-Israeli normalization. There's another burgeoning aspect of U.S. Gulf relations, which is cooperation on tech and tech policy. And we saw a lot of discussion on this at the end of the Biden administration, and there was the Biden executive order in December on diffusion of AI semiconductor chips. The Emiratis and some of the others are not completely satisfied with that executive order, and I think I anticipate a very robust conversation between the Trump administration and the Emiratis and also the other Gulf states on cooperation on tech. And again, this is a tremendous opportunity for both sides to grow business, to grow investment. The Gulf has a unique comparative advantage in this space because they've got the energy to drive these super energy intensive data centers. They've got the capital to invest in these really investment heavy projects. And they've got physical space where they can put these things. So the Gulf is really a good partner for the United States. And oh, by the way, this is an opportunity for the United States to secure a partner to the exclusion of our strategic rival, the Chinese.
And presumably, this is something that was front and center on the agenda with Sheikh Tahnoon's recent visit. And I'm sure they were already starting those conversations.
That's exactly right. And I think it's underreported. And of course, there's still things that we don't know about what came out of those conversations. And I assume, again, it's going to be a continuing conversation. These are still early days in the Trump administration. But I would say this could be one of the signal achievements of the second Trump administration.
Some have floated the idea that one of the kind of organizing principle for the administration's early moves is kind of squarely aimed at bringing Iran to the negotiating table. What do you make of that?
Well, obviously, the president sent a letter to the Supreme Leader and invited talks, and the Supreme Leader very theatrically rejected it. But what we hear anecdotally is that the Iranians are paddling furiously to get into some sort of engagement with the United States or with the international community on this issue of nuclear weapons, which they may, after all, be ambivalent about, but using as a lever. But how that manifests, how that proceeds, it's a little bit hard to say. I think there's an opportunity there.
So, a lot to follow up on here, and I think we will later on in the conversation. But before we do, I wanted to quickly turn back to your time in Iraq, where you served as U.S. ambassador between 2014 and 2017. So, you arrived in Baghdad at a very complicated time. The Islamic State forces were bearing down on the capital. In many ways, the country was teetering on the brink economically and politically. So, tell us a bit about the specific mission that the U.S. president asked you to fulfill as ambassador. And how did your embassy work with American federal agencies, not just state or the Pentagon, but also others like, for example, USAID, to accomplish those goals?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. When I arrived in Baghdad, ISIS had taken control of enormous parts of the country and was reported to be 35 kilometers from Baghdad. It was a terrible time of privation and suffering for the Iraqi people, both because of the violence that ISIS brought, but also because of the privation they were suffering because you had millions of internally displaced people throughout the country. My instructions from Washington and from the White House were sort of three ways. I mean, one was prosecute the war effectively, and of course we had a brilliant military team both on the ground and in Qatar and in Washington and in CENTCOM to carry that out, primarily through airstrikes. But also, as you said, at the same time that this was going on, Iraq was going through an economic crisis. The price of oil had collapsed, and the economy of Iraq is utterly dependent on the price of oil. That's how they pay for all of their government bills. So they were in an economic crisis. And three, again, as I mentioned, the humanitarian crisis. So ameliorating that. And, we had a really brilliant and gifted country team. We pulled together and we said, we're going to ruthlessly prioritize on these three things. At the same time, the administration was quite concerned about staffing at the embassy. They were worried about an evacuation if ISIS was able to advance further. They weren't, but prudent planning required us to prune the team. So basically, we did what we call a process of ruthless prioritization. And if you weren't working on prosecuting the war or solving the economic crisis or providing humanitarian assistance, you went home. And so that left a core group of people who were really committed and capable of focusing on those priorities.
We've seen a number of major changes to the U.S. government in rapid succession over the past 2 months. We've kind of skirted around this issue a little bit already, but those have included significant cutbacks to America's development assistance work and a clear shift away from the use of soft power tools. In your view, how will this affect the work of ambassadors on the ground in the region and their ability to achieve U.S. national interests?
Well, that's a great question. And I'll harken back to your previous question. So, again, 2/3 of my mandate in Iraq were solving the economic crisis and humanitarian assistance. And in both cases, AID played an absolutely central role. One of the things that we were able to do, and it's funny, I sat next to a World Bank expert just a couple nights ago at Iftar, And we were talking about the special program that the World Bank mounted to support the government of Iraq during that period of crisis. But we also, one of the things that the United States did, through the expertise of a really brilliant USAID economist, was that we arranged for a U.S. loan guarantee to the government of Iraq, so that so this enabled the Iraqis to borrow money at a at basically the rate that the United States borrows money at, and this enabled them to address their liquidity problems very, very quickly. And it also provided a lot of confidence for them to go out into the bond market and um, and be able to raise funds through the bond market, because the bond market took note of that confidence that the United States was expressing in the government of Iraq. That was all engineered by an AID economist on in my mission, working again with the interagency. Terrific support from Treasury and others, and I want to recognize their contribution as well. Similarly, what we said in Iraq was, let's take all this economic development assistance that we've been investing and put it towards humanitarian assistance. And so the AID mission mobilized around that idea and made a tremendous difference in people's lives, just delivering calories to children, in areas that had been really stricken. And in that regard, we worked very closely with the UN mission. And the woman who was leading the UN humanitarian mission, Lise Grande, to me, she's one of my heroes. She did incredible work to deliver this humanitarian assistance to people who are really suffering. And she was fearless in going to these places that were, really challenging and difficult. My security teams wouldn't let me go to places that she would go to. And she delivered this assistance. But again, all mobilized by the outstanding professionals in USAID. Those who've worked with me over the years in the Foreign Service know that there are many programs at AID that I would be happy to see reduced or even eliminated. But there are other programs that AID has led in these times of crisis when you need them, that nobody else in the U.S. government can replicate.
We're seeing, as many analysts are warning, that ISIS may be on the verge of resurgence in Syria. They obviously have not been entirely defeated inside of Iraq either. So, what are some of the key lessons from the counter ISIS campaign during your time in Iraq for the ongoing efforts against the group today?
Well, I think the key lesson is that we have a U.S. military presence in northern Syria and in Iraq that is able to keep these ISIS elements in check. And it's possible that if they're removed, the forces that remain, the Iraqi forces, the Syrian forces, the Kurdish forces, will be able to do that. But I wouldn't want to take that chance. And so I think making sure that the U.S. military presence, particularly, our intelligence capabilities, are preserved, I think is going to be really crucial to security. I mean, I get it that certain Iraqi political forces would like to see the departure of these U.S. forces. Actually, in recent months, that chorus has diminished somewhat as they see the potential threat coming from a resurgence of ISIS. But on this point, even we can agree with the government of Iraq, we can agree with the new government in Syria, we can agree even with Tehran that nobody wants to see a resurgence of ISIS. So this should create some common ground for cooperation.
As we mentioned at the top of the program, after your career at the State Department, you switched gears and moved into the private sector. How did that experience change your perspective on the Middle East?
You're right. I had the opportunity to go to work for Bechtel, which is a great American firm. It's an engineering, construction, project management firm with projects in the United States and all over the world. It has an 85-year history in Saudi Arabia, lots of projects in the Gulf and in Egypt. And so it was a real privilege for me to work for Bechtel and to have that experience. I'll tell you one thing, it taught me a real respect for U.S. firms who go to abroad to try to do business in markets that are new to them. Whenever I was going out as a U.S. diplomat, I always knew that I had the full coverage of the U.S. government, of the American people. That's a nice blanket to have around your shoulders. And going out as Bechtel and going out with other, U.S. firms who we would collaborate with, you don't have that same blanket. You're out there not completely on your own, lots of support from the U.S. government and from the U.S. embassies, but you're much more on your own than you are with the U.S. government. So that forced me to understand better how to interact with these foreign governments, these ministries, national firms. It was really a great experience.
There's a lot of talk, as you mentioned kind of at the beginning in our initial comments, about the regional states' economic and technological development plans. What are they prioritizing themselves on that front, and what industries or sectors do they see as kind of key to their future development?
There's danger in sort of throwing them all, lumping them all together. But obviously, the Emiratis have made very clear that they're very keenly interested in artificial intelligence and developing an ecosystem and infrastructure for that. All the countries in the region, I think, are interested in diversifying their economies, becoming less dependent on fossil fuels. They're not walking away from fossil fuels, but they want to have more diverse economies. The Saudis, of course, have Vision 2030. From the beginning, that's been all about diversifying the economy, making it less reliant on fossil fuels, but also getting young people into new and interesting jobs, including young women. Those have been very successful programs. Those are, of course, aimed at tech, but also aimed in the health care center and other areas. There's been a lot of investment in Saudi Arabia in new infrastructure, new communities, new real estate, and those are really exciting projects. At Bechtel, I had the privilege of working on the Riyadh Metro, which at the time was the largest civil works project in the world. And it took a little bit longer than planned because it was, built during the period of the pandemic. But it is still the fastest that any major urban transit system has ever been created. And it's a tremendous facility and asset now to the people of Riyadh.
Taking a step back and looking at the region with your private sector hat on, what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for U.S. business across the region?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, a big challenge is competing with China. For a firm like Bechtel, we frequently found ourselves competing toe to toe with the Chinese, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. And a lot of times that's challenging because Chinese firms tend to be able to offer much lower price, at least at the entry level. I mean, sometimes those prices balloon, and there's hidden costs that aren't, in the original offer sheet. And of course, this is changing a little bit, but during my time at Bechtel, they were frequently able to bring speedy and very inexpensive financing. And that can be a very important determinant for governments or major clients.
State-backed finance.
State-backed financing, exactly right. The United States doesn't have that capability in its toolkit. We have the Exim Bank, we have DFC, but they cannot move at the speed that the Chinese financial institutions can move, and they also couldn't bring the level of financing that the Chinese firms could bring. Now, again, there's a trap in that Chinese financing. And there's one of the reasons that they're so fast is because maybe they don't do all of the due diligence. They don't do the environmental and social impact analysis that needs to be done for important projects to make sure that you're actually getting what you want. So XM, GFC requiring those things is a good thing, but there's still room for U.S. institutions to move faster, more aggressively, and with more capability to help U.S. firms compete with the Chinese.
You just spoke about the various innovative and future-looking sectors that the rising Middle Eastern economies are looking to develop. And you also went into some of the ways in which these countries are increasingly cooperating with outside actors in pursuit of those goals. And at the top, we've spoken today about the dramatic geostrategic realignments in the region that have been going on for the past year and a half. So with all of this in mind, I wanted to quickly shift back to Iraq and locate that country within that context and where it's headed. How has Baghdad's regional role changed post October 7th, and what role does it want to play moving forward?
That's a wonderful question. And, the Iraqis have consistently expressed interest in being an intermediary for engagement between the West and Tehran and other states in the region and Tehran. I don't think they're yet seen in that way, but their willingness to play a role, I think, is commendable. The economy of Iraq hasn't changed much since I left in 2017. It's still hugely dependent on fossil fuels. And if you fly over southern Iraq at night, you're shocked by the flaring of the gas. So it's every day it wastes a massive fortune in natural gas that could be used to power Iraqi industry, heat Iraqi homes, drive Iraqi generators. What we're seeing now, and I think we've already seen the Trump administration dropped the first shoe on the issue of sanctions waivers. So now, what the Trump administration has told the Iraqi government is that they will no longer grant a waiver for the purchase of Iranian electricity. This is an Iranian sanction, but because the Iraqis were importing this electricity, they were given a waiver because they needed the power, even though they're flaring all this gas in southern Iraq. The next shoe to drop, I suspect, I do not know, will be to remove the waiver for the importation of natural gas. And this is going to really put Iraq in a very difficult position from an energy standpoint, and how it addresses this problem is going to be very interesting. I think there's opportunities to address some of the things that they haven't been addressing for a decade by capturing that gas and putting it into pipelines and monetizing it for the national benefit and weaning themselves off Iranian gas. I think that would really raise their credibility. But, Iraq also is riven by political divisions, not just the sort of the classic Sunni, Shia, Kurd, though those differences exist, but even within those communities, there's quite a bit of division. So finding political unity in Baghdad remains a challenge. And in the absence of that political unity, I think getting decision making that's going to move Iraq forward, both sort of politically and economically, is going to be challenging.
Since 2003, Iraq had been a theater of U.S.-Iran competition and contestation, and you actually sort of alluded to that a moment ago with the electricity sanctions waiver talk. But increasingly, Baghdad is also being courted by, it can reach out to, or it must take into account other powers like China or its Arab Gulf neighbors. How has this changed Iraq's room for maneuver within the region?
It's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of room for growth in terms of Baghdad's relations with its Arab neighbors. Think that the neighbors still regard Iraq as being under the influence of Tehran, and not enough has been done to change that perception. In regards to China, China is Iraq's best customer for the oil that it produces. And that has created some opportunities for Iraq to, borrow money at preferential rates. And generally, now the biggest international oil company inside of Iraq is the Chinese National Oil Company. Total is there. There's no U.S. companies left pumping oil in Iraq today, which is a big difference from even 10 years ago. So I think from a Iraqi standpoint, we often hear from them. They want to work with the United States. They want to work with U.S. firms, but they haven't created a business environment that is really conducive to that. And that's, I think there's a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of interest in doing that. But these political divisions within the country, and again, the malign Iranian influence, make it very difficult.
What do you think are America's key competitive advantages in dealing with Iraq, and what can it offer that others cannot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the other major challenges that Iraq has is water. So, the flow of the Tigris and Euphrates has reduced, and more water is being consumed upriver, not only by the Iraqis, but also by the Turks and the Syrians. And so, in summertime in Basra, the water supply is in serious jeopardy. Children are not getting enough clean water in Basra in the summertime, and it's a chronic and annual problem. And one of the things that I have talked to Iraqi officials about is addressing this with, a significant investment in desalination. And this could also support the oil industry. So far, that kind of major project hasn't been possible. So I would say that, again, U.S. technology, U.S. cooperation, U.S. business values. As the Iraqis know, when you deal with U.S. firms, you're not going to deal with corruption, because those firms will face significant consequences back in the United States, even though that may be under review. So there are tremendous opportunities for the Iraqis to benefit from their relationship with the United States, just as the Gulf is, through technology, innovation, investment, good values, clean business practices. Also, when U.S. firms go into a place to do projects, they bring a safety culture, and they teach a safety culture to workers that enable them to survive the project and come back whole and go back to work on other projects. That's a huge sort of soft power benefit that is not well understood.
And longer term, how do you see Washington's relationship with Baghdad evolving, especially in light of the scheduled U.S. troop withdrawal by September of 2025?
Well, I think you said it earlier, Matt, that right now the administration is very much seeing its relations with Iraq through the Iranian prism. And so I think if Iranian interests have been set back in Lebanon, Iranian interests have been set back in Syria, Iran continues to support and foster the popular mobilization forces inside of Iraq. Maybe they're not giving them as much money as they used to. Maybe they're not as closely tethered as they were during the time of Qasem Soleimani. But the presence of those forces outside of the Iraqi military structure is a big problem. I think that the Trump administration is going to look at Iraq through the Iranian prism, but that the Iraqi government, Prime Minister Soudani, possibly his successor after next October elections, can bring some ideas and opportunities for the Trump administration that they would see as attractive in this area of business cooperation, technology cooperation, infrastructure cooperation.
So further potential for cooperation on the horizon, but definitely complications as well.
It's very challenging.
We've covered a lot of ground in today's conversation. We are running short of time, but before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Well, I just want to say how great it is to be here at MEI. I'm really honored to be selected as its 18th president. MEI has been here since 1948. It's the oldest Washington-based think tank focused on Middle East issues. It's got a terrific team of scholars, of editors like yourselves. It's got these tremendous platforms like the podcasts and the website and the convenings. And I would just hope that if anybody's listening, and I hope you are, that you'll look at other ways to engage with MEI, because we're really interested in expanding our base, the number of people we're dealing with, and we want to engage deeply. The mission that was handed down by our founder, George Kaiser, is to improve relations between the people of the United States and the people of the Middle East, and also to educate people in the United States about the region. And so that's a mission that we take very seriously. And we've got wonderful people doing that work. And we'd really welcome more people to get involved in this.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but thank you very much for joining us today, Stu.
Thanks, Alistair. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can find MEI's latest coverage of regional issues on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information on upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.